The house had been sitting there longer than anyone wanted to admit. Tucked at the edge of the neighborhood, half hidden by overgrown weeds and sagging trees, it looked like a mistake the HOA wished the city would quietly erase. The paint was faded to a dull, uneven gray. The windows were clouded with years of neglect. The roof sagged just enough to make people uncomfortable when they looked at it too long. It was the kind of place neighbors avoided mentioning, as if speaking its name might make it theirs. For years, it had been labeled a problem without anyone ever solving it. Previous owners walked away. Investors toured it once and never returned. Contractors shook their heads and laughed. And the HOA treated it like a contagious disease, constantly complaining about how it ruined the aesthetic, while doing absolutely nothing to fix it. That neglect was exactly why it caught my attention. While everyone else saw an eyesore, I saw opportunity. The listing price was almost suspiciously low. Cheaper than any house in the area by a wide margin. It was the kind of deal that made people assume something had to be wrong, something hidden, something dangerous. But the truth was simpler. Nobody wanted to deal with the HOA. Nobody wanted to fight the neighborhood politics. Nobody wanted to touch a house the community had unofficially blacklisted. I did. The purchase went through faster than expected. No bidding war. No competition. No last-minute drama. Just paperwork, signatures, and silence. The moment the deed transferred, the house became mine, and in that instant, everything changed. At first, the reaction was subtle. Curious glances from behind blinds. Conversations that stopped when I walked by. HOA board members suddenly appearing on evening walks they never took before. The neighborhood had noticed, and they didn't like what they saw. Not because the house was getting worse, but because someone had finally claimed it. The HOA records painted an interesting picture. Years of complaints stacked on top of each other. Unenforced fines. Half-written warnings. The house had been used as a convenient excuse for every issue in the community. Property values dipping. Blame the abandoned house. Complaints from residents. Blame the abandoned house. The HOA leadership had built a narrative around it, and my purchase shattered that narrative overnight. Almost immediately, the tone shifted from indifference to control. Inspection notices started appearing. Rule reminders showed up in my mailbox. Vague warnings about bringing the property into compliance were sent before I had even unloaded my tools. It was clear the HOA didn't see me as a homeowner. They saw me as a threat to their authority. What bothered them most wasn't the condition of the house. It was the fact that I didn't ask permission. I spent the first few weeks simply cleaning. Clearing trash. Cutting back weeds. Boarding broken windows properly. Small steps that showed progress, but not fast enough for the HOA. Every improvement seemed to trigger another inspection. Every repair led to another letter. The more effort I put in, the more aggressive they became. The house started to look better, and that terrified them. Neighbors who once ignored the place now complained that construction noises were disruptive, even when no work was happening. Anonymous reports claimed violations that didn't exist. The HOA president began making public comments about protecting the neighborhood and preventing undesirable outcomes, language that sounded official but meant absolutely nothing. Behind the scenes, something darker was brewing. One particular neighbor took shows of interest a bit too far. Always watching. Always timing my arrivals and departures. Always conveniently present when HOA officials came by. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't random. Someone nearby had been enjoying the abandoned house exactly as it was. Quiet. Forgotten. Useful as a scapegoat. My presence disrupted that comfort. The house inspection reports became more aggressive. Accusations escalated. The HOA began suggesting the house was unsafe, unlivable, and potentially dangerous to the community. Words like hazard and liability appeared repeatedly, hinting at forced action if I didn't comply fast enough. Yet every claim fell apart under basic scrutiny. Permits were valid. Repairs were legal. The property met minimum standards. And that made them angrier. That's when the tension stopped being administrative and started feeling personal. Late one evening, I noticed fresh footprints near the side of the house. Nothing stolen. Nothing damaged. Just signs that someone had been there without a reason. A few nights later, trash was dumped near the property line, clearly placed to make it look like neglect. Each incident was small, but together they formed a pattern. Someone wanted the house to fail. The HOA continued applying pressure, but now there was something else in the air. A sense that this situation was moving beyond paperwork and warnings. The abandoned house had gone from being ignored to being contested, and not everyone was willing to lose quietly. As the renovations slowly moved forward, the hostility grew sharper. The house was no longer just a structure. It had become a symbol of resistance. Proof that the HOA couldn't control everything. And symbols tend to provoke extreme reactions. By the time the first major renovation phase was scheduled to begin, the atmosphere around the house felt charged. Neighbors whispered. HOA emails grew urgent. And one individual's behavior became openly hostile, though still carefully hidden behind plausible deniability. What no one expected was how far someone was willing to go to make sure that house never stood proudly again. And as the foundation work was being prepared, the cheapest abandoned house in the neighborhood unknowingly became the center of something far more dangerous than HOA. Fines and warnings. Something irreversible was coming. By the time the second phase of renovations was scheduled, the house had already become the most talked about property in the neighborhood. Not because it was beautiful yet, but because it refused to stay broken. Fresh boards covered the damaged sections. The yard was cleared. The structure no longer looked abandoned, and that alone was enough to disturb the delicate balance the HOA had maintained for years. The HOA escalated their tactics quietly at first. Notices became more frequent. Language became more threatening. Deadlines were shortened. Requirements appeared that had never been enforced on other homeowners. Everything was framed as routine, but the pattern was obvious. The goal wasn't compliance. The goal was exhaustion. Every step forward triggered 2 steps of resistance. Behind the official letters, something else was unfolding. Neighbors who once pretended the house didn't exist now treated it like a surveillance target. Cars slowed down when passing. Phones were raised a little too casually. Reports were filed about activities that never happened. It felt less like a community and more like a coordinated effort to provoke a mistake. The house itself seemed to absorb the tension. The air around it felt heavier. Workdays were shorter, not because progress had slowed, but because the pressure was constant. Every nail hammered felt observed. Every delivery felt judged. Then came the warnings about safety concerns. The HOA suddenly claimed the structure posed a risk to nearby properties. They suggested that ongoing renovations might destabilize surrounding land. None of it was supported by evidence, but the implication was clear. They were preparing a narrative. One where the house wasn't just unwanted, but dangerous, and narratives are powerful when something goes wrong. The first real incident happened late at night. The smell came before the sight. Smoke drifting unnaturally through the quiet street. By the time the fire was visible, it had already taken hold of the back section of the house. Flames licked through old wood, feeding on years of dryness and neglect. Emergency crews responded quickly, but damage was done. The fire was contained before it could destroy the entire structure, yet the impact went far beyond physical loss. The timing was too perfect. The location too specific. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't faulty wiring or leftover debris. Someone had wanted fire to touch that house. And almost immediately, blame began circulating. Anonymous tips were sent to authorities. Whispers suggested negligence. Claims were made that renovation materials were stored improperly. The HOA wasted no time distancing themselves publicly while privately pushing the narrative that the homeowner revealed their true irresponsibility. The story they wanted told was simple. The abandoned house was dangerous. The person who bought it made it worse. And the neighborhood was the victim. But the truth didn't cooperate. Investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. The burn patterns didn't match accidental ignition. The point of origin suggested intent. Footprints were found where no one should have been. And most importantly, the fire started in an area that had no active work being done. The fire had been placed. As facts surfaced, the HOA's confidence wavered. Their tone shifted from accusation to cautious neutrality. Publicly, they claimed cooperation revealed transparency. Privately, they began scrambling. That's when the second move was made. Evidence surfaced suggesting someone else was responsible. Someone convenient. Someone with access. Someone who could be blamed without raising suspicion. The attempt to redirect responsibility was subtle but calculated. It leaned heavily on assumptions, not facts. It failed. Attempt to frame someone else only tightened the focus on those who stood to benefit most from the destruction. The neighbor who had watched too closely. The complaints that had involved emotional language rather than legal reasoning. The repeated insistence that the house should never have been repaired. Patterns emerged. Investigators began asking uncomfortable questions. Questions the HOA didn't want connected back to them. Questions that forced individuals to explain behavior they thought had gone unnoticed. The house, damaged but still standing, became a silent witness. Instead of being erased, it became evidence. Repairs stopped temporarily, not because of HOA pressure, but because the situation had shifted into something larger. What had begun as a renovation dispute was now a criminal matter. And the spotlight that once intimidated now burned far brighter. Community members who had followed the HOA narrative quietly began pulling back. Silence replaced certainty. Support evaporated. No one wanted to be associated with something that could no longer be brushed off as drama. The house wasn't just surviving. It was exposing something rotten underneath the neighborhood's polished exterior. As investigators closed in, the HOA's authority weakened. Their influence relied on fear and assumption, and both were dissolving. The very house they tried to destroy was now forcing accountability they had avoided for years. But the story wasn't over. Because while the fire failed to erase the house, it ignited something else entirely. A chain reaction that would unravel alliances, reveal hidden motives, and turn the HOA's own tactics against them. The cheapest abandoned house had become the most expensive mistake they ever made. And the final consequences were just beginning. By the time the investigation reached its final stage, the neighborhood no longer felt united. The same streets that once echoed with quiet agreement now carried tension. People avoided eye contact. Curtains stayed drawn longer than usual. The confidence that once defined the HOA's authority had eroded, replaced by uncertainty and quiet fear. The fire had failed to do what it was meant to do. Instead of destroying the house, it exposed the truth behind years of manipulation. Investigators pieced together timelines that couldn't be ignored. Surveillance footage from nearby properties revealed movement that contradicted official complaints. Digital records showed patterns of coordinated reporting that traced back to a small, influential circle rather than random residents. The narrative collapsed. The neighbor who had obsessed over the abandoned house became impossible to ignore. Their complaints had escalated emotionally long before any rules were violated. Their presence aligned too perfectly with key moments. Their version of events shifted every time new evidence surfaced. Pressure cracked the image they had carefully maintained. And with that crack came everything else. It became clear that the house had never been the real problem. Control had been. The HOA had relied on abandonment as leverage, using decay as justification for authority. When someone stepped in and refused to play along, the system panicked. They couldn't find a ghost anymore. They couldn't threaten a property that was finally being repaired. Their power depended on stagnation. The fire was meant to reset everything. But it backfired. Legal consequences followed swiftly. HOA records were subpoenaed. Years of selective enforcement were exposed. Rules applied harshly to some and ignored for others were documented in uncomfortable detail. The same board members who once hid behind formal language now struggled to explain inconsistencies that had been normalized for years. Resignations followed. Quiet at first. Then suddenly. Positions were vacated under the guise of personal reasons. Meetings were postponed. Decisions were deferred. The structure that once dominated the neighborhood collapsed inward, undone by its own tactics. Meanwhile, the house stood damaged but defiant. Restoration resumed with renewed determination. Repairs that had been delayed now moved forward without obstruction. Inspectors who once nitpicked suddenly found nothing wrong. The same HOA that once flooded the mailbox with threats now kept its distance, careful not to attract further scrutiny. Neighbors noticed. The house transformed steadily. Structural damage from the fire was repaired and reinforced. What had once looked fragile now felt stronger than before. Fresh siding replaced charred wood. The roof was rebuilt properly. Landscaping softened the edges that once made people uncomfortable. And with each improvement, the neighborhood's story changed. The abandoned house was no longer a warning. It became proof. Property values stabilized. Complaints dropped. The absence of constant HOA interference revealed that many of the neighborhood's problems had never been about rule-breaking at all. They had been about power. The neighbor most closely tied to the fire faced consequences that couldn't be avoided. Investigations didn't rely on rumor anymore. Evidence spoke clearly. Accountability arrived without drama, without spectacle, and without mercy. Attempts to shift blame failed completely. There was no one left to frame. As the dust settled, the HOA was forced to reform under oversight. New leadership emerged cautiously, stripped of unchecked authority. Rules were clarified. Enforcement became consistent. Fear-based compliance was replaced with transparency, not because they wanted to change, but because they had no choice. The house had forced that change simply by existing. By the time renovations were complete, the cheapest abandoned house had become one of the most solid properties in the area. Not the largest. Not the flashiest. But undeniably resilient. It carried scars, but those scars told a story the neighborhood would never forget. People who once avoided it now slowed down to look. Some with curiosity. Some with regret. Some with quiet respect. The irony was impossible to ignore. The HOA didn't lose control because someone broke the rules. They lost it because someone followed the law, refused intimidation, and stayed standing when they expected collapse. The house that was supposed to disappear became permanent. And long after the fire was forgotten, long after the board members changed and the warning stopped, the lesson remained embedded in the neighborhood's memory. Sometimes the thing everyone wants gone is the only thing strong enough to expose the truth. And sometimes, buying the cheapest abandoned house costs far more than money, but pays back in ways no HOA ever expects.